Hey everybody, good to be back in class with you all. I'm looking forward to this semester of spiritual formation because recovery and deliverance is an issue that has come up a lot in our church. We have a lot of people in recovery. Some people very close to me actually have gone to treatment recently for alcohol, and so I'm hoping that I can pick up some stuff from this class in order to be a better pastor to those people. And so, for that reason, I'm glad we're reading this text, and I'm also glad that the author does make a big point of emphasizing grace. And one of the things I'm always trying to be cognizant of is as a pastor, you know, psychology and counseling and therapy and that sort of thing aren't necessarily what I'm trained in, and sometimes perhaps I feel like we tend to overreach a little bit, or maybe think that we know more than we do when it comes to issues of counseling and psychology, um, or at least we try to do it in a way not appropriate for our field. And so, what I'm saying is that I like the fact that he comes in from a theological angle, from a biblical perspective, with the angle of grace, but still with the mix of the psychology and stuff like that, so that we can at least learn it. But as a pastor, the peace that I bring to somebody in recovery is that of grace and of Christ, and I think that's always something that's good to remember as we're going into this. So, long story short, I'm excited to learn more. Summary of the reading: he talks a lot about repression and addiction. He says that repression is the milder of the two, and essentially it involves ignoring or displacing certain desires and focusing on safer things. And the example that he uses is that a lot of times we tend to repress our desire for God. We all have a deep-seated longing for God, but many of us tend to repress that desire. But then he goes on to addiction, and that's where he spends the most of the chapter. It's the more evil of the two, and instead of displacing a desire, we attach desire. And we're all addicts, he says, and we're all in the process. We all have the processes in us that go into creating an addiction. So we're all addicts at some level. And he says we can't master addiction by our own effort, but an addiction sidetracks our deepest desires and replaces them with something artificial. But one of the paradoxes that he talks about in addiction is that while we can't master it on our own, and it's kind of the enemy of grace in a lot of ways. In another way, in another sense, it's a conduit of grace, because nothing drives us to our knees and nothing helps us understand our helplessness more than an addiction. And so, in a sense, suffering with an addiction and recognizing our addictions can actually give us a greater appreciation for the grace of God, which is a really neat thing to think about, I think. And I've seen that as I've ministered and worked with addicts. They come out of treatment kind of having this spiritual renewal a lot of times, where they really understand God's grace, and that seems to be a big influence on their lives. So that's kind of neat. Bondage was one of the words we were supposed to define. I would kind of, say it has to do with captivity to anything or anyone. Something I thought about with bondage was that maybe, unlike addiction, bondage can be something that happens to you, whereas an addiction, a lot of times people get themselves into that mess, whether it be through taking the first drink or or the first hit of a drug or whatever. Um, Captivity can be something that happens to you. Somebody could kidnap you, and that's or bondage. I'm sorry. That's a form of bondage, physical, I suppose. Um, don't know if that's right, but it's just what I thought of. So it can be something completely outside of our control from the very beginning. Recovery, uh, perhaps that might be just the process of healing from addictions. And I notice that my alcoholic friends always say that they're recovering alcoholics. They don't refer to themselves as recovered alcoholics. And so I use the word process here because I suppose it's something that probably never really ends, but that healing continues on and on and on. Deliverance, I think, is just the experience of salvation, of freedom from sin that comes through the grace of God, that only comes through the blood of Christ. Deliverance, I think, has that salvific connotation to it. It goes beyond simply ending your addiction, but actually being restored um, by God. My church is the Ransom Church, and we've got a lot of people in recovery, a lot of people probably struggling still with that. Well, if what our author says is right, then we're all struggling with addictions. But we have a lot of people particularly struggle with alcohol. We've had Celebrate Recovery in the past. we will do it again. But we're definitely in a place where we can do a lot of ministry to people in recovery. And so we have recovering alcoholics who lead the recovery group. I wouldn't try to step in and do that. Apparently, and I understand why this is the case, but apparently, people who are alcoholics are the best, or addicts are the best people to help other addicts recover. So that's what we found to be the case in our ministry, and that's what I anticipate finding to be the case in the future as well. Okay, so thanks everybody. Looking forward to this semester.